The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite, casting long shadows across the marble floors of what many considered the most luxurious residence in Manhattan. Richard Blackwood stood motionless before the expansive window, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his graying temples betraying his 45 years. Below him, the city bustled with life, but up here in his tower of glass and steel, silence reigned supreme. 3 years. 3 years since Margaret had left this world, and still, every morning felt like the first day of an endless winter. The penthouse that once echoed with laughter and warmth now felt like a mausoleum of memories. Richard had built an empire worth billions, starting from nothing more than ambition and determination. But all his success felt hollow without her presence to share it. He moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. The same breakfast prepared by his housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, the same financial reports reviewed at his mahogany desk, the same empty conversations with business associates who saw him only as a means to their own advancement. The routine was a lifeline, keeping him anchored to a world that had lost its meaning. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Henderson's gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Davidson is here to see you." Richard turned from the window, straightening his tie. Charles Davidson had been his business partner for over a decade, one of the few people who had known Margaret and understood, to some degree, the depth of Richard's grief. If Charles was here without an appointment, it meant something significant. Charles entered the study with his usual confident stride, but Richard noticed something different in his demeanor. There was an excitement, an energy that seemed almost inappropriate given the solemn atmosphere that perpetually surrounded Richard these days. "Richard, my friend," Charles began, settling into one of the leather chairs across from Richard's desk. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about how you mentioned feeling disconnected." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. He had regretted sharing even that small vulnerability with Charles, though it had been during a particularly difficult evening when the weight of his solitude had become almost unbearable. "I have a proposition for you," Charles continued, leaning forward with the intensity of a man about to close a major deal. "There's an opportunity, a way to address some of your concerns, a private gathering, very exclusive, very discreet." "I'm not interested in your social events, Charles," Richard replied curtly, turning his attention to the documents on his desk. He had attended several such gatherings since Margaret's passing, each one a painful reminder of how alone he truly was, surrounded by people who spoke to his wealth rather than to him. "This is different," Charles insisted, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "It's not about business or networking. It's about companionship, Richard. Real companionship without the complications of traditional relationships." Something in Charles's tone made Richard look up. There was a gleam in his friend's eyes that he had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and something darker that Richard couldn't quite identify. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard asked, though part of him already sensed he wouldn't like the answer. Charles smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "There are young women, Richard, beautiful, intelligent young women who find themselves in difficult circumstances. Their families face financial hardships, and they're willing to provide companionship to men like us, men who can appreciate their qualities." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. Companionship? Think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, Charles explained, his voice smooth and persuasive. "These women receive financial security, their families are helped, and you wouldn't have to spend another evening alone in this place." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below. Richard had built his fortune on understanding people, on reading between the lines of every conversation, every proposal. What Charles was describing sounded like something that would have disgusted him just a few years ago, something that went against every principle Margaret had helped him develop. But Margaret was gone, and the principles she had inspired felt as distant as she was. "These women," Richard said slowly, "they choose this?" "Of course," Charles replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. Their families make the arrangements, usually to help with debts or other financial difficulties. Everyone benefits, Richard. Everyone gets what they need. Richard stood and walked. Back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The city below continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggling with their own problems. Somewhere among them were young women facing impossible choices, families drowning in debt, parents making decisions that would change their children's lives forever. When? Richard heard himself ask, the word escaping before he could stop it. Tomorrow evening, Charles said, and Richard could hear the smile in his voice. It's being held at the Meridian Club. Very private, very exclusive. Just a few select gentlemen and a handful of exceptional young ladies. Richard closed his eyes, feeling as though he stood at the edge of a precipice. Behind him lay 3 years of crushing loneliness, of nights spent wandering through empty rooms filled with memories of a life that could never be reclaimed. Ahead lay something unknown, something that promised to fill the void even if it couldn't heal the wound. I'll consider it, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles rose from his chair, the sound of his movement sharp in the quiet room. I'll send you the details. Richard, I know Margaret would want you to find some happiness again. She wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone in this tower. After Charles left, Richard remained at the window for a long time, watching the sun set over the city. The penthouse grew dark around him, but he didn't turn on the lights. In the growing darkness, he could almost see Margaret's reflection in the glass, could almost hear her voice asking him what he thought he was doing. But when he reached out to touch the glass, there was nothing there but the cold surface and his own uncertain reflection staring back at him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a small town in Ohio, 18-year-old Emma Sullivan sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to grow larger every day. The foreclosure notice lay on top of the pile, its harsh legal language a stark reminder that her family had just 30 days to find a solution to their mounting debts. Her father, Tom Sullivan, had been a hard-working man all his life, a factory worker who had always provided for his family with dignity and pride. But the factory had closed 2 years ago, and despite his efforts to find new employment, the bills had continued to accumulate. Emma's mother had been struggling with illness, and the medical expenses had pushed them past the point of no return. Emma had dropped out of college after her first semester, taking a job at the local diner to help with expenses, but her wages barely covered the groceries. She had watched her father grow thinner and more desperate with each passing month, had seen the weight of failure crushing the man who had once been her hero. Emma, sweetheart, we need to talk. Her father's voice made her look up from the bills. Tom Sullivan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his face bearing the expression of a man who had wrestled with an impossible decision and found no other way forward. Dad, if this is about the house again, I told you we'll figure something out, Emma said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Maybe I can pick up more shifts at the diner or... Emma, stop. Tom's voice was gentle but firm. There's no more time for maybes. The bank won't extend the foreclosure deadline, and we owe more than this house is worth anyway. Emma felt her heart sink. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't prepared herself for the finality in her father's voice. There's an opportunity, Tom continued, his words coming slowly, as if each one caused him physical pain. A chance to solve all our problems, to take care of the debts, to get your mother the treatment she needs, to give us a fresh start. What kind of opportunity? Emma asked, though something in her father's demeanor filled her with dread. Tom sat down across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for hers. There's a man, a businessman from New York. He's looking for a companion, someone young, intelligent, someone who could keep him company. Emma stared at her father, not quite comprehending what she was hearing. Dad, what are you saying? He's offering enough money to pay off all our debts and give us enough to start over somewhere else. Your mother could get the surgery she needs, and we could move somewhere where I can find work again. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Emma felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as though she had stepped into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. "You're asking me to," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm asking you to save our family," Tom said, his eyes filling with tears he had been holding back for months. "I'm asking you to do something I never thought I would have to ask any of my children to do. But Emma, I don't see any other way." Emma looked around the kitchen that had been the heart of their home for so many years. She thought of her mother, upstairs, weak and fighting an illness that was slowly taking her away from them. She thought of her younger brother, Michael, who was supposed to start his senior year of high school in the fall, and her sister, Sarah, who dreamed of becoming a teacher. "How long?" she asked finally. "I don't know," Tom admitted. "The arrangement would be open-ended. But Emma, if you do this, if you make this sacrifice, you'll be saving all of us." Emma closed her eyes and tried to imagine a life she had never wanted, a future that felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught to value. But when she opened them again and saw her father's desperate face, she knew that love sometimes demanded impossible choices. "When do I have to decide?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Tom said. "He's expecting an answer tomorrow." The Meridian Club had been designed to be invisible to those who didn't belong there. Tucked away in a discreet corner of Manhattan's Upper East Side, its unremarkable facade belied the opulence within. Richard Blackwood had been a member for over a decade, but tonight marked the first time he had entered these halls for anything other than legitimate business dealings. The private dining room Charles had reserved was smaller than Richard had, expected, intimate in a way that made him uncomfortable. Heavy curtains blocked any view of the street below, and the lighting was deliberately dim, casting shadows that seemed to hide as much as they revealed. 6 men sat around the mahogany table, all familiar faces from Richard's world of high finance and corporate power. Men like himself, successful and influential, but tonight they were here for reasons that had nothing to do with business. "Gentlemen," Charles began, rising from his seat with the confidence of a seasoned auctioneer, "tonight we have some exceptional young ladies to meet. Each one comes from a family facing significant financial hardship, and each one is here voluntarily, with full family support." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The clinical way Charles spoke about these women, as if they were commodities, to be evaluated and acquired, sent a chill through him. But the loneliness that had driven him here whispered that this was his chance to fill the void that had consumed him for 3 years. "Our first young lady is Emma Sullivan, 18 years old, from Ohio," Charles continued, as the doors to the dining room opened. Richard's breath caught in his throat as Emma entered the room. She was beautiful, certainly, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and green eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and determination. But it wasn't her beauty that struck him most forcefully. It was the way she carried herself, the proud set of her shoulders despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Emma wore a simple black dress that had clearly been chosen to present her at her most appealing, but Richard could see the tension in every line of her body. She was terrified, yet she walked into that room with a dignity that made Richard feel ashamed of his presence there. "Emma comes from a hard-working family," Charles explained as Emma stood before the table, like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Her father was a factory worker before the plant closed, and her mother requires medical treatment that the family cannot afford. Emma was studying literature before family circumstances required her to leave college." Richard found himself studying Emma's face as Charles spoke, looking for some sign of resignation or acceptance. Instead, he saw something that surprised him: defiance. Even in her fear, even facing a room full of powerful men who saw her as something to be purchased, Emma Sullivan had not surrendered her spirit. "Emma," Charles addressed her directly, "would you like to tell these gentlemen a bit about yourself?" Emma's green eyes swept across the room, meeting each man's gaze with a directness that made several of them look away. When her eyes met Richard's, he felt something stir within him that had nothing to do with the arrangement Charles had described. "My name is Emma Sullivan," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor Richard could detect underneath. "I'm here because my family needs help, and I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to provide that help." The simple honesty of her statement hit Richard like a physical blow. Here was a young woman who had been forced into an impossible situation. Yet she faced it with more courage than he had shown in 3 years of hiding in his penthouse. Emma has agreed to a long-term arrangement, Charles continued, and her family's debts total approximately $200,000. The successful bidder would be expected to cover these debts as well as provide ongoing support. Richard felt sick. The casual way Charles discussed Emma's life, reducing her circumstances to a financial transaction, made him question everything that had brought him to this moment. Yet he found himself unable to look away from Emma, unable to stop thinking about the strength it must have taken for her to walk into this room. The bidding began with an almost surreal politeness, as if they were negotiating the purchase of a racehorse rather than a young woman's future. Richard listened in growing horror as the men around him discussed terms and expectations with the casual indifference of experienced buyers. 300,000, came a voice from across the table. 400, another man countered. Not bothering to look up from his phone, Richard watched Emma's face as the numbers climbed higher. She stood perfectly still, but he could see the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, the way she had to concentrate to keep her breathing steady. This was a nightmare for her, yet she endured it with a grace that humbled him. 500,000, Richard heard himself say, the words escaping before he had consciously decided to speak. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Emma's gaze met his again, and this time he saw something different in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, but perhaps a recognition that he was different from the others, that his presence here came from pain rather than predatory intent. 500,000 going once, Charles announced, clearly pleased with the escalation. Going twice, 600,000, came a voice from the end of the table. Harold Morrison, a real estate magnate with a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. Richard felt something cold and possessive rise within him. The thought of Emma going with Morrison, a man he had always found distasteful, filled him with an anger he hadn't expected. But more than that, he found himself genuinely concerned for what would happen to her in Morrison's care. $1 million, Richard said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was profound. Even Charles seemed stunned by the figure, and Harold Morrison leaned back in his chair with a look of grudging respect. $1 million, Charles repeated, his voice barely concealing his excitement. Going once, going twice, and sold to Mr. Blackwood. Richard felt the words hit him like a physical blow. What had he just done? In a moment of possessive anger, he had essentially purchased another human being, something that went against every moral principle he had ever held. Yet as he looked at Emma, seeing the mixture of relief and apprehension in her eyes, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. The legal arrangements were handled with the efficiency of any high-stakes business transaction. Papers were signed, money was transferred, and Emma's fate was sealed with the same clinical precision that Richard used to close corporate deals. Throughout the process, Emma remained silent, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. As the evening concluded and the other men departed, Richard found himself alone with Emma in the club's opulent lobby. She stood a few feet away from him, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for him to speak or act or give her some indication of what her life would be like now. "Emma," Richard began, then stopped, unsure of what to say. How did one begin a conversation with someone they had just purchased? "I want you to know that this isn't something I've ever done before." Emma nodded, her green eyes studying his face carefully. "I didn't think it was," she said quietly. "You looked as uncomfortable as I felt." Her directness surprised him. He had expected fear, perhaps resentment, but not this clear-eyed assessment of the situation they both found themselves in. "Your family," Richard said, "the money will be transferred tomorrow. All their debts will be cleared, and there will be enough left over for your mother's medical treatment and your brother and sister's education." "Thank you," Emma said, and Richard was struck by the genuine gratitude in her voice, even under these circumstances. "I have a car waiting," Richard continued. "We'll go to my apartment and we can discuss the arrangements. I want you to understand that I don't expect..." He trailed off, frustrated by his inability to articulate what he was trying to say. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma said, and something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. "I may be young, and I may be in a difficult situation, but I'm not naive. I understand what kind of arrangement this is supposed to be, but I want you to understand something too. I may have agreed to this to save my family, but that doesn't mean I'm going to simply accept whatever you decide my life should." "Bea." Richard stared at her, taken aback by the quiet strength in her voice. Here was a young woman who had just been sold to a stranger, yet she was setting boundaries, asserting her own agency in whatever small way she could. "I wouldn't expect you to," Richard replied, and meant it. "Emma, I want you to know that whatever happens, you'll be treated with respect. You have my word on that." Emma studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. Finally, she nodded. "Then let's go," she said simply. "I'd like to see what my new life looks like." As they walked toward the exit, Richard found himself thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. He had come here seeking to fill a void, to find some way to ease the crushing loneliness that had consumed him since Margaret's passing. Instead, he had found himself responsible for a young woman whose courage and dignity had already begun to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The car ride to his penthouse was conducted in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the irrevocable step they had just taken. Richard stared out at the city lights, wondering what Margaret would think of what he had done. Emma gazed out her own window, watching her old life disappear behind them as they moved toward an uncertain future. Neither of them could have anticipated how profoundly this arrangement would change both their lives, or how the walls they had built around their hearts would soon begin to crumble in ways they never expected. The penthouse that had felt like a mausoleum to Richard suddenly seemed even more imposing with Emma's presence. As she stood in the marble-floored entryway, taking in the soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard saw his home through her eyes, cold, opulent, and utterly lacking in warmth. "This is impressive," Emma said carefully, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Richard watched her as she moved through the living room, her fingers trailing over the expensive furniture with the cautious touch of someone afraid of breaking something valuable. Everything in this apartment had been chosen for its cost rather than its comfort, selected to impress rather than to welcome. "Mrs. Henderson has prepared a room for you," Richard said, gesturing toward the hallway that led to the guest quarters. "It has its own bathroom and sitting area. You should have everything you need." Emma turned to face him, and Richard was struck again by the directness of her gaze. "And what exactly do you need from me, Mr. Blackwood?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Richard wasn't sure he was ready to address. He had spent the entire car ride wondering the same thing. What had he expected when he made that bid? What had he thought this arrangement would actually provide? "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty of the statement surprising them both. "I've been alone for 3 years, Emma. My wife, Margaret, she was everything to me. After she was gone, I thought I could handle the solitude, but it's been..." He paused, struggling to find words for the crushing weight of his grief. "I suppose I thought having someone here, someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, might make it bearable." Emma studied his face for a long moment. "You want a companion, not what the other men at that table wanted." "I want to remember what it feels like to not be alone," Richard said quietly. Emma nodded slowly as if processing this information. "Then I think we need to establish some ground rules, Mr. Blackwood. If this is going to work, if I'm going to be able to live with myself, there have to be boundaries." Richard was struck by her composure, by the way she was taking control of a situation that should have left her powerless. "What kind of boundaries?" "I'll have dinner with you. I'll make conversation. I'll be present when you need company," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. "But I won't pretend to be something I'm not. And I won't pretend to feel something I don't. And if you ever try to force me into anything I'm not comfortable with, our arrangement ends, regardless of the consequences." Richard felt a mixture of admiration and shame. Admiration for her strength, shame that she felt such boundaries were necessary. "Emma, I would never—" "You bought me tonight," Emma interrupted, her green eyes flashing with something that might have been anger. "Ski. Whatever your reasons, whatever you tell yourself about companionship and loneliness, the fact remains that you paid money for me like I was a piece of property, so forgive me if I don't take your word for granted." The words hit Richard like a slap. She was right, of course. Whatever his intentions, whatever pain had driven him to that room tonight, he had participated in something that reduced her to a commodity. The realization made him feel sick with self-loathing. "You're right," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what brought you to that room tonight, and I'm sorry for my part in it. But Emma, I want you to know that while you're here, you're not property. You're a person and you'll be treated as such." Emma searched his face again, and Richard had the feeling she was trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded. "Then show me to my room," she said. "Tomorrow we can figure out how this is going to work." The next few weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. Emma had her own space and her own schedule, but gradually, almost naturally, their lives began to intersect. She would join him for breakfast, reading the newspaper while he reviewed his business reports. In the evenings, they would share dinner, their conversations tentative at first, but growing more comfortable with time. Richard found himself looking forward to these interactions in a way that surprised him. Emma was intelligent and well-read, despite having had to leave college. She had opinions about everything from literature to politics, and she wasn't afraid to disagree with him when their views differed. After 3 years of conversations with people who only told him what they thought he wanted to hear, her honesty was refreshing. "You're wasting your time with that merger," Emma said one evening over dinner, nodding toward the financial documents Richard had been studying. Richard looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Morrison Industries," Emma said, taking a sip of her wine. "You're considering a partnership with Harold Morrison, right? The man who tried to bid on me." Richard felt his jaw tighten at the memory. "It's strictly business, Emma, a potentially profitable alliance." "It's a mistake," Emma said firmly. "I've been reading about his business practices. He has a pattern of entering partnerships, learning his partner's trade secrets, and then finding ways to force them out. You'd be giving him access to everything you've built." Richard stared at her, impressed despite himself. "You've been researching Morrison?" Emma shrugged. "I've had time on my hands, and I was curious about the men who were at that table. Most of them have questionable reputations, but Morrison is particularly ruthless. He destroys people, Mr. Blackwood. Is that really who you want to do business with?" That night, Richard found himself reviewing the Morrison deal with new eyes, looking for the warning signs Emma had identified. To his surprise, he found them. Small things that his excitement about the potential profits had caused him to overlook. Red flags that Emma's objective perspective had spotted immediately. He cancelled the deal the next morning. "You were right about Morrison," he told Emma that evening. "I looked deeper into his background and there were several concerning patterns. Thank you." Emma smiled, and Richard realized it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her since she had arrived. "You're welcome." It felt good to be useful for something other than looking pretty at dinner. The comment stung because it revealed how Emma saw herself in this arrangement, but it also made Richard realize something important. Emma wasn't just intelligent and beautiful, she was perceptive in ways that could actually be valuable to his business. More than that, she was becoming valuable to him as a person. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself sharing more of his life with Emma. He told her about Margaret, about how they had met in college and built their life together. He talked about the early years of his business, the risks and failures that had eventually led to success. Emma listened without judgment, offering insights that often surprised him. In return, Emma began to share her own story. She talked about her family, about her father's pride and her mother's illness. She spoke about her dreams of finishing college and becoming a teacher, dreams that now seemed impossibly distant. Richard found himself moved by her resilience, by the way she had maintained her hope despite everything she had been forced to sacrifice. "I miss reading," Emma said one evening as they sat in the library, surrounded by Richard's extensive collection of books. I mean, really reading, not just newspapers and business reports. I miss getting lost in a story. Richard looked around at the thousands of volumes that surrounded them, books he had collected but rarely had time to enjoy. Then read, he said simply. Take whatever you want. That's what they're here for. Emma's face lit up with an enthusiasm. That reminded Richard how young she was, how much of her life was still ahead of her. Really, you wouldn't mind? Emma, everything in this apartment is available to you, Richard said, meaning it. I want you to be comfortable here. But even as their relationship grew more comfortable, Richard was aware of the fundamental inequality that underlay it. Emma was there because she had no choice, because her family's survival depended on her sacrifice. No matter how kind he tried to be, no matter how much he respected her intelligence and strength, the fact remained that she was trapped in a situation not of her choosing. This awareness came to a head one evening when Richard returned, home to find Emma on the phone, tears streaming down her face. I understand, Dad, she was saying, her voice thick with emotion. I know you had to make a choice. I know you didn't want this for me. Richard retreated to his study, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private moment. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed, the pain in Emma's voice, the weight of the sacrifice she was carrying, not just for herself, but for her entire family. When Emma joined him for dinner an hour later, her eyes were still red from crying, but she had composed herself with the same dignity she showed in everything she did. Is everything all right? Richard asked gently. Emma was quiet for a long moment, pushing her food around on her plate. My brother started his senior year of high school today, she said finally. My father called to tell me how excited Michael is about his classes, about the college applications he's working on. My mother is responding well to her treatment. She looked up at Richard, and he saw both gratitude and profound sadness in her eyes. They're all doing well because of what I'm doing here, because of the choice I made. Emma, Richard began, but she held up a hand to stop him. I'm not looking for sympathy, Mr. Blackwood. I made my choice with full knowledge of what it meant, but sometimes, hearing about the life I gave up, the future I sacrificed, it's harder than I expected. Richard felt the weight of his responsibility for her situation settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Emma was here, trapped in this arrangement because he had made it possible. Her family was thriving because of his money, but Emma herself was paying the price. What if there was another way? Richard asked suddenly. Emma looked up at him, confusion in her green eyes. What do you mean? What if I could ensure your family's security without requiring this sacrifice from you? What if you could go home, finish college, have the life you planned? Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Richard saw hope flicker in her expression before being quickly suppressed. That's not how these arrangements work, Mr. Blackwood. You paid for my companionship. If I leave, who knows what happens to my family's financial security? Richard realized she was right. The agreement he had entered into was binding in ways that went beyond legal contracts. It was about trust, about Emma's family's faith that she would honor her commitment. If she left, there would be no guarantee that their needs would continue to be met. But as Richard looked at Emma, saw the resignation in her posture and the dreams she was trying to forget in her eyes, he made a decision that would change everything. Emma, he said carefully, what if I told you that there might be a way to honor your commitment to your family while still reclaiming your own life? What if this arrangement could evolve into something different, something that serves both our needs without requiring you to sacrifice everything you are? Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Richard saw something kindle in her eyes that hadn't been there since the night he had first seen her. A glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward. Richard's proposal hung in the air between them like a lifeline neither of them was sure they could trust. Emma set down her fork, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or false hope. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked carefully. Richard leaned forward, his mind racing with possibilities he had never considered before. You're brilliant, Emma. These past few weeks you've shown insights into business that most of my highly paid consultants miss. What if, instead of being here as what you are now, you worked for me, legitimately? As a business consultant, an analyst, Emma's breath caught. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't have a degree. I barely finished one semester of college." "You have something more valuable than a degree," Richard said with growing conviction. "You have perspective. You see things others miss because you're not trapped in the same mindset as everyone else in my world. Tonight, for instance, you probably prevented me from making $1 million mistake with Morrison." For the first time since Emma had arrived, Richard saw genuine excitement in her expression, but it was quickly tempered by caution. "And my family?" she asked. "The arrangement we have, it's the only thing keeping them secure." "Your family's security would be guaranteed regardless," Richard said firmly. "Emma, what happened at that club? What brought you here? It's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. But if I can transform it into something that gives you back your future, while still honoring the commitment to your family, then maybe some good can come from this terrible situation." Emma was quiet for a long time, and Richard could see her, mind working through the implications, the possibilities, the risks. Finally, she spoke. "You would do that? Create a legitimate job for me, ensure my family's continued security, and ask for nothing in return except my professional skills?" "I would," Richard said without hesitation. "Emma, you've already given me more than I expected when I made that bid. You've reminded me what it feels like to have genuine conversation, to share ideas with someone who challenges me. You've made me remember that there's a world beyond my grief." Over the following weeks, Richard began implementing his plan. He created a position for Emma as a special consultant, focusing on merger analysis and business development. Her official salary would more than justify her presence in his life, and it came with benefits that would ensure her family's long-term security. But as Emma threw herself into her new role, something unexpected began to happen. Richard found himself seeing his business and his life through her eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma said one morning, looking up from a stack of reports, "I've been reviewing your charitable giving and I'm concerned." Richard looked up from his own work. "What kind of concerns?" "You donate money, yes, but it's all to established organizations that basically serve as tax write-offs. You're not actually involved in making a difference." Emma's voice grew more passionate as she continued. "You have the resources to create real change, to help people in situations like mine and my family's, but instead you're just writing checks to feel better about your wealth." Her words stung because they were true. Richard had always considered himself generous, but Emma was right. His charity had been more about tax benefits than genuine compassion. "What would you suggest?" he asked. Emma's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that reminded Richard of Margaret when she had been passionate about a cause. "We could create a foundation, something focused on helping families in crisis, not just giving them money, but providing pathways to stability, job training, education assistance, medical support, comprehensive help that addresses root causes, not just symptoms." The idea energized Richard in a way nothing had since Margaret's passing. Working with Emma, he began developing plans for what would become the Sullivan Foundation, named at his insistence after Emma's family. But their growing partnership faced its first major challenge when Richard's brother, James, arrived unexpectedly at the penthouse one evening. James Blackwood was everything Richard had once been: cold, calculating, focused solely on profit and power. He took one look at Emma, who was reviewing foundation documents at the dining room table, and his expression darkened. "Richard, I need to speak with you privately," James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. In Richard's study, James wasted no time getting to the point. "What the hell are you doing with that girl?" "Emma is my business consultant," Richard said carefully. "She's been invaluable in helping me identify profitable opportunities and avoid costly mistakes." "She's the girl you bought at Charles Davidson's auction," James shot back. "Don't try to dress it up as something respectable. The whole arrangement is scandalous, and if word gets out, it could destroy everything we've built." Richard felt his anger rising. "Emma is one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. She's transformed how I approach business, and she's helping me create something meaningful with the foundation. Foundation? James's voice rose. Richard, you're talking about giving away millions of dollars because some girl half your age has convinced you to play charity. She's manipulating you, can't you see that? Get out, Richard said quietly. What? I said get out of my home, Richard repeated, his voice growing stronger. Emma Sullivan has more integrity in her little finger than most people in our social circle have in their entire bodies. She's not manipulating me. She's helping me become the man I should have been all along. James stared at his brother as if seeing him for the first time. If you continue down this path, if you keep throwing money away on these ridiculous social causes, I'll have to take action to protect our family's interests. What kind of action? Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I'll call a board meeting. I'll present evidence of your erratic behavior since Margaret's passing. Your colleagues are already concerned about some of your recent business decisions. Add in this scandal with the girl, and I think I can make a compelling case that you're no longer fit to run the company. The threat hung between them like a sword. Richard had built his business empire from nothing, but James held significant shares and had allies on the board. If he chose to move against Richard, the battle would be devastating for everyone involved. Do what you think you have to do, James, Richard said finally. But I'm not changing course. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I'm living instead of just surviving. I won't give that up, not even for the company. After James left, Richard found Emma waiting in the living room, her face pale with concern. I heard, she said simply. Richard, you can't risk everything you've built because of me. If your brother moves against you, then I'll face the consequences, Richard interrupted. Emma, do you know what I was before you came here? I was a wealthy man who had forgotten why wealth mattered. I was successful but empty, powerful but purposeless. You've reminded me that money is just a tool. What matters is what you do with. To Emma's eyes filled with tears. But your company, your life's work, will survive regardless, Richard said firmly. But if I back down now, if I let James dictate how I live my life, then I'll have learned nothing from these past months with you. The board meeting James called was every bit as brutal as Richard had expected. James presented his case methodically, highlighting Richard's recent charitable giving, his cancelled deals, and his association with Emma. He painted a picture of a man whose judgment had been compromised by grief and poor decision-making. But Richard had prepared for this moment. When it came time for his response, he stood before the board with more confidence than he had felt in years. Everything my brother has said is true, he began, surprising everyone in the room. I have been making different decisions lately. I have been more selective about the deals I pursue, more focused on long-term value than short-term profit. And yes, I have been investing significantly in charitable causes. He looked around the room at faces he had known for years, men and women who had helped him build his empire. What James hasn't told you is that these changes have made our company stronger, not weaker. We've avoided several deals that have since proven disastrous for our competitors. Our more selective approach has resulted in higher quality partnerships and better returns, and our charitable work has improved our public image and attracted top-tier talent who want to work for a company that stands for something beyond profit. Richard paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not the same man I was 3 years ago or even 3 months ago. I'm better. I'm more focused, more purposeful, and more committed to building something that will last beyond my lifetime. If you want to remove me from leadership because of that, then perhaps this isn't the company I thought it was. The vote, when it came, was closer than Richard would have liked, but decisive nonetheless. The board voted to maintain his leadership, swayed by both his passionate defense and the undeniable improvements in the company's performance. That evening, Richard returned to the penthouse to find Emma packing. What are you doing? He asked, alarm filling his voice. Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears. I can't stay, Richard. Your brother was right. My presence here is scandalous. It's going to continue causing problems for you, and I won't be responsible for destroying everything you've worked for. Emma, the board voted? This time, Emma interrupted. But James won't give up. He'll keep looking for ways to use me against you. The only way to protect what we've built, the foundation, your company, is for me to disappear from your life." Richard stared at her, feeling as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Where will you go?" "I've saved enough money to finish college," Emma said, closing her suitcase. "I can get my degree, become the teacher I always wanted to. My family is secure now, thanks to you. I can have the life I dreamed of." "And what about the foundation? What about our work together?" Emma smiled through her tears. "The foundation will succeed because it's built on solid principles, not because I'm involved. You don't need me anymore, Richard. You've remembered who you are, what you're capable of. You'll be fine without me." Richard felt panic rising in his chest. "Emma, please don't go, not like this." Emma walked over to him, and for a moment Richard thought she might change her mind. Instead, she reached up and touched his face gently. "Thank you," she said softly, "for treating me with respect when you had no obligation to, for seeing me as a person when others saw me as property, for giving me back my future and helping me save my family." "Emma, Richard began, but she shook her head. "Don't make this harder than it already is," she whispered. "Let me go." "With dignity, Richard. Let me leave knowing that I did the right thing for both of us." As Emma walked toward the door with her suitcase, Richard felt as though his heart was breaking all over again. But this time, it wasn't the sharp, devastating pain of loss he had experienced when Margaret passed away. This was different, the ache of watching someone you care about make a sacrifice you know is right, but wish was unnecessary. "Emma," he called out as she reached the door. She turned back, her hand on the doorknob. "If you ever need anything, that's all you call me, promise me that." Emma nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Then she was gone, leaving Richard alone in his penthouse once again. But this time the solitude felt different. The apartment was quiet, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the work they had done together, the conversations they had shared, the plans they had made for helping others. Emma had given him back his purpose, his passion for making a difference in the world. 6 months later, Richard stood in the conference room of the Sullivan Foundation, surrounded by staff members who shared his vision of comprehensive family assistance. The foundation had grown beyond his wildest expectations, helping hundreds of families avoid the desperate circumstances that had forced Emma into that auction room. "Mr. Blackwood," his assistant said, interrupting his thoughts, "there's someone here to see you." Richard looked up to see Emma standing in the doorway, but she was transformed. Gone was the frightened young woman he had first met. In her place stood a confident college graduate, her auburn hair pulled back in a professional style, wearing a crisp business suit that spoke of success and self-determination. "Hello, Richard," she said, stepping into the room. "Emma," Richard breathed, hardly able to believe she was there. "What? How are you?" "I'm good," Emma said, and Richard could see that it was true. There was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of accomplishment and purpose that transformed her entire bearing. "I graduated last month with a degree in social work and non-profit management. I wrote my senior thesis on comprehensive family crisis intervention." Richard felt pride and admiration swell in his chest. "Emma, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." "I came here with a proposition," Emma continued, her voice steady and professional. "The foundation is doing amazing work, but I think it could do more. I think it needs someone who understands what it's like to be on the receiving end of its services, someone who can ensure that the people you're helping are truly being empowered, not just rescued." Richard stared at her, hardly daring to hope. He understood what she was suggesting. "I'm offering to work for the foundation," Emma said, "legitimately, professionally, as someone qualified to help shape its mission and implementation, if you'll have me." "Emma," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "nothing would make me happier." As they shook hands, as equals, as partners in a shared mission, Richard realized that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most meaningful transformations. What had begun as a transaction born of desperation and loneliness had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to ensuring that other families would never face the impossible choices that had brought them together. The Sullivan Foundation continued to grow under their joint leadership, becoming a model for comprehensive family assistance programs across the country. Richard had found his purpose again, not in the accumulation of wealth, but in its meaningful distribution. Emma had reclaimed her future while honoring her past, using her experiences to help others navigate their own crises with dignity and tact. And sometimes, late at night in the foundation offices, as they worked side by side planning new programs and reviewing success stories, Richard would catch Emma's eye and see reflected there the same sense of gratitude he felt, not for the circumstances that had brought them together, but for the transformation those circumstances had made possible. They had both been broken when they met, trapped by grief and desperation respectively. But together, they had built something beautiful from the fragments of their former lives, proving that even the darkest moments can become the foundation for unexpected light. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard and Emma's journey has moved you as much as it moved us. This story shows us that sometimes our greatest challenges can become our most profound opportunities for growth and redemption. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore the depths of human resilience and transformation. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the power of second chances. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we look forward to seeing you in the comments section.